Hey guys, what's up? This is False Bulls 123, and guess what? I got a haircut. Anyway, guys, it has been. Sorry, there's something on my wall. It has been about a week since, my lockdown has ended. I am back at the grill, and I have like 50,000 cuts and bruises on my hands, so how you doing? And I am finally ready to basically do my quarantine wrap up. So if you guys don't know, I have been reading since I think sometime around April. It was about a week or two into my sort of quarantine lockdown. You can literally watch my daily vlogs because I talk about it. Actually, no, I believe I actually started reading about a couple of days into the quarantine, if I do remember correctly. I downloaded an audiobook. It was Gone Girl. I downloaded The Woman in Cabin 10. I basically has just been reading this entire time during the quarantine. Another thing I was doing is during the time I actually got really into booktube, and I really wanted to take my channel in a new direction, kind of do more bookish videos while also trying to find more of, I guess, my type of content. Something that I'm interested in doing and kind of finding my own brand. And I've been doing pretty well with my content, but I think that I can do more with it. And I'm really excited for that. So guys, I'm going to just get into it, kind of start talking, because we have a lot of books to cover, and if I don't shut up real quick and keep talking, we're going to be here for 5 hours. So, one thing I did, and what I really like with BookTube wrap-up videos, that's a word, is pretty much when they start with sort of statistics, quantifying the sort of content they read. I really like the idea of that, and so I did that for my own wrap-up. So, for the 3 months or the 87 days, you want to phrase it, that I was in lockdown for the COVID-19 quarantine, I read, I believe, 34 books. And if my math isn't exactly correct on it, sue me in the comments. Literally, I'll link my Goodreads. You can check my fucking receipts, and we ain't gonna worry about it. And so it was about, I believe, 34 books, which averages out about 10 to 12 per month, which I think, as reading, paces go, is not too bad. And this is, my peak reading state. So, I ain't, cool, Books of Lala and just, slamming through those books. But, like most things in my life, I think that's a nice B+. Or at least just a B. I'm gonna give myself a B. Okay, fam? Perfect. Get them grades, y'all. Even though I haven't been in school for, 2 years. Anyway, so of those 34 books or whatever I said, 24 of them were fiction and 8 of them were nonfiction. And I'm going to go into genre breakdown. I'm going to go into a few things. So as demographics go, I wanted to, going forward, moving forward, I definitely want to be reading more diverse authors and definitely reading more diverse voices. And I definitely failed this initially. Looking at the books I've read, looking at sort of the diversity and the demographics, my books are incredibly whitewashed, and that is really the truth of the matter. But I'm going to get into actual statistics so that we can look at what I mean by that. So let's start with gender breakdown, right? 16 were male, 17 were female, and 2 were non-binary. I initially thought that I had only read of one non-binary author, but I recently discovered that Casey McQuiston uses they/them pronouns as well, and that they're gender fluid, and so that was actually really interesting because I did not know that about them when I was actually doing some research about the authors. So I missed that. I've actually read 2 non-binary authors, so small point. And then if we break it down by, I guess, nationality, we also see another obvious bias. 28 of the authors that I read were American, 4 were British, 2 were Canadian, and actually 4 were English, so I'm not quite sure their exact nation in the United Kingdom, but they were of that general vicinity. 2 were Canadian, and 2 were Nigerian, actually, which I thought was interesting that, of I guess, English-speaking countries, both of the authors were of Nigerian nationality. And then when we move on to, I guess, sexuality, which there were... So the interesting thing is that, for some reason, people aren't super explicit about whether or not they are heteronormative on, their biographies. And I'm just that makes it difficult to, like, sort of break down these demographics. Because, I mean, like, I kind of wish there was just a database that, like, let people know if they, like, sucked a titty once, you know? Like, I would like that to be readily available, and I understand that, like, you know, sexuality is a deeply personal thing, and that people aren't going to, unless someone is, like, very open or upfront about, like, you know, their queer identity or about other identities, like, you know, it's not something that is, like, super, I guess, common knowledge, I guess, you know? And so I wasn't able to find a lot of information about the sexualities of the authors I was reading, and so a few of them were unknown. Also, for the purpose of you wondering, like, how did I find out this information? Did I just assume their sexuality? Generally, I assume that if, like, you know, someone had a heteronormative spouse, that they were at least a little bit straight. I feel that we can comfortably make that assumption. And so, at least, so the people that I mentioned are straight, they're at least straight. I don't know if they're possibly, like, you know, bi or pan or demisexual, any of those sort of things, or have other queer identities that are not, like, you know, mentioned in the biographies. So, at least, so, essentially, of the authors, 25 of them were straight or at least straight passing. 1 was bisexual, and 9 I was unable to find any information or inferences about their sexuality at all. I don't particularly pick up readers just because they are LGBT or not LGBT, though I do want to read more queer fiction in the future, and that is a step that I'm going to be taking throughout my channel, because I am going to try to make an effort to read more diverse voices. And I say try, not because I think I'm going to fail, but just because I dislike using absolutes when making promises, for some reason. Let's just go with that. And so here we get into my biggest disappointment. The ridiculous amount of straight washing is my second disappointment. But my biggest disappointment is mostly just how white, like, my book selection is. And you're like, what's wrong with white people, Ryan? And, like, nothing. But considering that America is an incredibly diverse population, and considering that Americans aren't the only people that write books, but the entire world does, in fact, imagine that, you would think that a person who is reading a fair variety and, I guess, cross-section of books would be reading books from a variety of authors of different abilities, sexes, genders, and races. And the fact of the matter is that of these very myriad and various selection of books that I've read during this time, it has been incredibly white, male, and heteronormative. Really, the only demographic that I have read representatively is in gender, which is, I guess by this point, pretty equalized when it comes to publication. But in other cases, of the writers that I've actually read, very, very homogenized and biased towards the majorative. So, racial breakdown. 27 of the authors that I read were white, 2 were black, 1 was Asian, 1 was Hispanic, 1 was Jewish, which I listed it just because it was mentioned, though I'm never really sure if... I've always, like, been a bit confused about, I guess, that separation, because Jewish is an ethnicity / I guess, cultural religion. And so, if I understand correctly, there could be multiple people of different races that are Jewish, but they were Jewish. Anyway. And there were 3 authors who were of 2 or more races of various, like, you know, I guess, racial identities. And so, as we can see here, and I'm actually very disappointed about that, especially since the people of color that I have read, I was sort of, like, you know, picking out the book because I wanted to read a book from, like, you know, that type of voice, from that type of person. And so I'm very disappointed that unless I was intentionally looking to read a book from a Latinx experience or a book from, like, you know, an Asian American experience, that all the books that I chose, I guess, sort of, without that forethought, were predominantly heteronormative and white. So, I'm very disappointed in, like, you know, I guess those demographics, because, you know, I thought it would have been a lot more diverse than it actually was. However, that's making me more aware of the situation, of, like, you know, I guess the situation, and I am going to be trying to read much more diverse authors in the future. Especially since I've been hearing about a lot of really amazing books that sound so cool. They're about all these, like, you know, sort of, like, areas of society that I've never, like, you know, heard about. And I'm really interested in sort of reading those books and sort of understanding those experiences. So, next up, let's break it down essentially by, I guess, age category. So, some people are just like, well, young adult is its own genre, but it's really not. Young adult, middle grade, adult, all of these like terms are really categorizations describing the sort of generalized age of the people, of both the characters and the intended audience, as we know. And so generally when it comes to age categories, we're expecting certain themes, but I don't enjoy using it as a description of genre because I think that puts too many limitations on books in general and our expectations of what adults and children and teenagers should read. So, accurately age categorizations. So, moving on from that diatribe, one book was, I guess, marketed towards children, below age 8. 2 were middle grade, 5 were young adult, and 17 were of an adult category. Also, for these numbers, I did not consider nonfiction books to be described as adult, as I don't really believe that nonfiction can really have a set age of when somebody should read it. Obviously, there is nonfiction that is intended to be educational or meant for a certain audience, but I just dislike the idea of categorizing nonfiction by age, because does that mean that knowledge should only be allowed for certain people or by certain groups? I dislike that idea. And so let's move on to the fiction genres that I read. Let's see. Or fiction and nonfiction, actually. I've broken down both. So this is in no particular order. 4 were thrillers, 4 was horror of various kinds, 3 were memoirs, 3 were food writing. Essentially, I consider food writing a book that has a focus on eating or food in general, and usually one's experiences with that. 3 was fantasy, 5 were sci-fi, 1 was literary, and by literary, I know that it's a bit of a vague term, but I generally consider a book literary if it has very complex themes and is meant as sort of an introspection on, a lot of things. So if there's a book that I would, expect to read in an English class and discuss the themes about it, or if it's a book that I could imagine somebody writing an essay on, I would consider that literary. Obviously, you can discuss any book. That's the purpose of a BookTube channel. And you can write an essay on, ideally, any story, no matter how simple or convoluted. But generally, I imagine a literary novel to be one that has complex themes that they're trying to explore, and have a specific reason for discussing those themes outside of the generalized plot. 3 were contemporary, which essentially just means it was a non-fantastical setting set during the modern day, or I understand the distinction is usually around the 1960s is when contemporary is considered, but you can have your own understandings of what contemporary actually means, as contemporary, by definition, is relative. 2 was crime fiction, and so when I say crime fiction, I generally mean both true crime and fictional crime, and 2 were romance. And so let's actually get into the books that I read. I'm also trying to remember what the second romance novel was. Don't remember. It must have been good. I'll find it. I wrote it here, that's what it was. I remember now. Okay, so I'm going to be going in chronological order from, I guess, just sort of this beginning of my quarantine to the end of my quarantine. Also, if you guys have been watching my daily quarantine vlogs, which I will put a playlist at the end of this video if you want to check it out, I have been doing weekly reading vlogs and mentioning, my reading in several other vlogs during that period. But I also made sure to kind of, be a sneaky boy and hide things from you, like a teenager with a crack addiction. So, okay, guys. So now that we've kind of, talked about the demographics, let's actually talk about the books that I have read this fine quarantine evening, if you will. So, just a little bit of formatting-wise, I'm going to start with the books that I actually finished all the way through, front to cover. And if you want to know, am I the type of person that reads, the afterword, and, the blurbs and the sequel, and, the author's note, and all that other bullshit? I do not. I ain't got time to read nobody's minutia. I'm onto the net. I'm here for the pulp. I ain't there for the ride. I'm just saying. Then I'm going to have a few words about the 2 books I did DNF during this quarantine. And I am also going to put in a brief mention about 4 of the books that I put down. If you haven't been watching my vlogs, put down basically means that I was enjoying the book, that for one reason or another, I needed to put it down or I could not finish it before I needed to return it, since unlike, a lot of booktubers, I really can't afford to be going out there buying every new book in this shiny little dust jacket that's coming onto the market. I ain't even got time to buy thrift, I am a poor, broke bitch, and that's just how the cookie crumbles. So that is also why only 2 books I actually read physically. Of the other 32 books, I read a variety of audio and ebooks, and I'm not going to specify which one because I don't have the brain power to remember that shit. So let's actually get into it and talk about the first book I read. If you've been following my vlogs, you'll probably know that this was Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn. Now, I had never read a Gillian Flynn novel before, and so, I didn't know what it was about. I remember, everyone was talking about it. It was, super edgy. And I'm like, gotta break me a piece off of that edge. And so, essentially, Gone Girl is the story of a woman who essentially frames her husband for murder. And her husband is just like, what? I didn't murder my wife. You murdered my wife. And so it deals with, on one hand, her hiding her identity and how she went about this, really fucked up thing. And on the other hand, it kind of talks, it's the husband sort of navigating the media circus. And the book talks a lot about, I guess, media perception when it comes to sensationalizing crime, especially the idea of violent crime against women. And also just, sort of an exploration of Amy and Nick's character. So I did a full review of this book, and I think it's really good. It was just absolutely fantastic. It was also really the first thriller I ever read. And so, as an introduction to the genre, it was, oh my goodness, so good. So I gave it 5 stars. And I know, first book I read of the year, 5 stars, kind of biased in your results, Ryan, ain't you? But you know me, I am a positive bitch. And so it was a fantastic book. I ain't got too much to say about it just because I literally said everything you could say about it in my review. Go watch it. I don't want to talk about it anymore. Next up, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator by Roald Dahl. So I am a huge Roald Dahl fan, and so this is actually the only book I did reread during this quarantining, which I'm going to stop saying now because the joke's not that funny. And so, Ryan, you're like, I know about Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. That is a childhood classic which got made into 2 separate movies. But what about Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator? What's that book about? Well, it's the charming, wholesome story of a boy getting inside of a giant glass elevator, going into orbit, breaking into a space hotel, destroying an alien life form that was trying to kill them, and then watching his grandparents turn into babies, essentially rescuing his grandmother's spirit from the void and avoiding, void monsters, and then basically having his grandparents turn back into old people before his eyes. And you're like, well, Ryan, I didn't know that Roald Dahl wrote visceral horror. Well, he didn't. That was supposed to be whimsical. Also, because Oompa Loompas in the just lovely slave colonies love to sing horrific songs about what happens to children, also had a lovely moral lesson about not taking laxatives, because it'll give you the shits. I am not kidding. That is still part of that book. And so, Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator was interesting. It definitely had Roald Dahl's, signature whimsy, but it definitely kind of falls into the realm of unnecessary sequel. It had some interesting stuff in it. It was definitely a lot more impactful when I was a kid reading it than I am reading it now as, an old fogey of 22 years. And because of that, I give it 3 stars. It's good. It's definitely aged. There's a few jokes in the book which I'm not going to say are necessarily offensive, though I am not of, I guess, the people that would be offended by it, and so that's really taken with a grain of salt. But they definitely border on politically incorrect. And I don't think that Roald Dahl necessarily was trying to be insensitive with these jokes. But I think, with a lot of older media, there tends to be a lot more of caricature, or at least more joking along racial lines. For instance, think about Mary Poppins, or even Peter Pan, how they would have, I guess, Native Americans or African people, and there would be not necessarily negatively depicted, but very much stereotyped. Even when, the representation was meant to be positive, it was still very exotification-y. But I'm going to be moving on because, unlike Mary Poppins and Peter Pan, which had some very egregious examples of what I'm talking about, it's literally just a one-off pun about Chinese surnames. So, yeah, that part didn't age well, and there's a lot of jokes that were just kind of weird, but it was okay as Roald Dahl goes. Not my favorite book, but it wasn't necessarily trash as a book, But definitely because of Roald Dahl's, whimsical, type of writing, it also was a bit hit or miss plot-wise. And that's all I'm going to say. All I'm going to... Anyway, guys, so moving on, I actually read a book that I was really excited to read, and that was Miss Peregrine's Home for Peculiar Children. So, if I was going to define it genre-wise, I'd probably define it as horror fantasy. So, I don't remember the name of the main character. They had a name, I remember that part, just not what it was. It is essentially the son of a very rich pharmaceutical, company. Basically, his mom owns Rite Aid. And so he's never really wanted for nothing. But he remembers, but he's very fond of his grandfather, who was a bit of a loon. You know how it is. Who told him all these, scary stories about scary story things. And essentially monsters that he destroyed, throughout his career. And so, basically, he's going along, living his best life, essentially doing nothing with his life because he feels like he hasn't earned it, which is correct. But pretty much, he just feels lost in the sauce. Until one day his grandpa horribly, viscerally dies. Probably due to wild animals, but who knows? I'm not a medical examiner. And so he essentially becomes he essentially develops an anxiety disorder, and he's really trying to comprehend sort of just whether or not, how his, grandfather died, and all these, other, emotional issues. And basically, to find closure, to find a sense of peace over, the death of his grandfather, he goes to Wales to essentially look at this old orphanage that his grandfather lived in when he was very young. And not only to sort of find a sense of peace with, the death of his grandfather, but also to really see if any of those old stories, those, old wives' tales, were actually true. And so, given the fact that I described this as a fantasy novel, you might have an inkling that maybe shit gets real. And that's precisely, kind of what up. The first time I ever read Miss Perigrines Home for Peculiar Children was actually the graphic novel version, which I really liked. But ever since I read the story and, actually knew what it was about, I've wanted to read the original book. And so, now that I've actually finished it, I really enjoy it. I'm probably not going to pick up the sequel for a while just because I'm really bad at reading sequels. And there's not a lot of series where, I'll finish one book and I'll be like, yeah, let's get it right now. Let's go on. Second series. Let's see what's happened. Let's get on this bullshit. Because usually I read, a story and I'm full, you know? You have a nice, meaty dinner. You just shove that in your gullet. And you don't want, another dinner. You're like, maybe let's get some dessert. Maybe I'll read a manga. But you ain't let's go for round 2. This time, let's try this steak. No, you're you want to let that digest. And I'm the same way with series, you know? I'll read one, I'm just I like this, but I like to savor my courses. You get me, capiche? I want to, savor it. So, like I said, really enjoyed the book. It was fantastic. If you're looking for sort of young adult fantasy, especially some kind of darker fantasies, definitely check out Miss Perigrines Home for Peculiar Children. One thing that was really unique about the books was essentially he used a lot of vintage photographs. And the Ransom actually talks about the use of the photographs in the sort of an office note at the ending, which was really fascinating. But essentially they use all of these sort of creepy old-timey vintage photographs and tie it into the story. And that was just such a fascinating sort of gimmick when the book first came out. I thought it was so interesting. And it worked really well to sort of provide a very novel, not that type of novel, but novel experience. So moving on, so that was pretty much some of the stuff I read in the first week. And I was thinking during the quarantine, I wanted to explore some stuff and actually read some authors that I had not heard about. And so I finally decided to bite the bullet, finally read Lovecraft. I'm a horror nut. I love horror. I've been reading all this stuff that's super Lovecraft inspired, excuse me. It's I've seen so much Ram City comedy things that I should probably read a Lovecraft story or something. And so I downloaded a couple of Lovecraftian audiobooks. So sometime in 2005, this company basically collated a bunch of sort of the essential Lovecraft and narrated it. And made a series of, I think, 5 or 7 audiobooks called The Dark Worlds of H.P. Lovecraft. And so the next one I listened to was part 1, which essentially featured the Dunwich Horror and the Call of Cthulhu. And so I'm enjoyed them. I thought they were really good stories. I like the Dunwich Horror a lot, mostly just because of the way it was described. It had this very... Lovecraft has a very sort of gothic feeling to his work, a lot, almost Poe-esque, in that sort of like, decadence and just sort of moral decay in society. And so you get like all that feels to it. But Lovecraft also has this very, I don't know, like almost inbred sort of uneasiness. So if you think of, what was it, that recent Resident Evil game with like, you're in like backwaters Louisiana, like sort of like that feeling of a very sort of messed up family. And so if, like think about like that sort of like, it just the sort of uneasiness that gives you. And I guess sort of like, apply it to sort of Lovecraft in general. And that description is really broad. Obviously, that's pretty much the description of Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But, like, essentially have this sort of like, at the same time you have like this sort of like implied inbreeding and sort of like innocuousness through that. But then you also have like, a lot of the sort of like decay for poverty and recession and like all this other stuff that I guess would definitely have been in the forefront of American, like, I guess, the psyche, like during the Great Depression stuff, which is when H.P. Lovecraft lived. And so one thing I just love about the Dunwich Horror is like, just how the story like progressed, because it literally just ends up, I'm going to spoil it a little bit, it ends up with like these bunch of old dudes like trying to figure out what's happening, and they're like, I know, why don't we just use some eldritch magic to dispel like, the bad people? And they're like, that's a great idea, let me just get like, my Eye of Newt and get on that. And I'm just like, I love the idea of like an action hero just being like, maybe we should just open up these dusty magic tomes and like, figure shit out. And I'm like, that's one way to do it. Call of Cthulhu was also pretty interesting. Cthulhu's kind of like, peak Lovecraft is what everyone knows him for. And so I thought it was like, pretty interesting. I really enjoyed Lovecraft's sort of epistological style. A lot of his stories are told from a very... like, through epistological forms, usually through someone, like, looking for a bunch of case notes or journal entries or things like that. And so, I like that that was sort of a style for, like, a popular writer, like, back then. Before, I can't really say that epistological novels were never popular. Obviously, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is epistolary as well. So, it's like, I can't really say that, but I like the element just because I like epistolary work in general. So, I thought it was pretty good. The only issue was because it was an audiobook, I can't really get very into Lovecraft in audio form. Mostly just because he is a very dense writer. He uses very loquacious phrasing. He is overwrought at times. And I don't mind. I like people who write floridly. I myself do have an issue with purple prose sometimes because I like to get lost in the sauce when it comes to descriptions. I like to enjoy the scene and savor it. And so I like that in writing. I don't mind flowery prose. But at the same time, it is hard to comprehend due to its density in audio format. So it doesn't translate well to spoken word. And that really means that I had to reread a lot of the sections of these audiobooks just because, like, I would start zoning out because it would be like, this is all this stuff that happens, and it was super creepy, and some more super creepy stuff happened. And then, like, it was a bit more creepy. And I'm like, okay, this sounds pretty fucking creepy. So when do we get to see the monster? Anyway, but I liked it so far, and I'm trying to see if I can figure out what I gave it. I believe I gave it 3 stars. Yeah, I gave it 4 stars, actually. I believe we give the second one 3 stars. Anyway, but let's move on, and we'll talk about that, in a minute. So, next up is actually the first physical book that I read during the quarantine. So, my mom has this, freebie table at her apartment. Essentially, if you don't want something, you just, put it there, and, it eventually gets donated. But then, another tenant, comes by and, sees it or, wants it, they can just take it, which is really cool. I like that. And so she found this book, right? There's one of her I don't know what you call it, tenants, neighbors. That's the word I'm looking for, neighbors. Basically had all of these 9/11 conspiracy, 9/11 conspiracy books, a lot of them. And so all of these 9/11 era political books, all these things were just laying on the table. And I found this one which called When You Ride Alone, You Ride with Bin Laden. And I'm looking at this. I'm looking at this cover, and I'm like, what the fuck is this cover? Oh, it has a subtitle, What the Government Should Be Telling Us to Help Fight the War on Terrorism. And I'm thinking, well, my God, like, this book is just like, what, I'm thinking, like, what is it about, you know, because, like, I'm pretty sure I don't ride with Bin Laden. Bitch calls for shotgun, and I'm just like, dude, you're already dead. But obviously this book was written before Bin Laden was killed. Anyway, so I'm just like, what is this book about? Also, it's by Bill Maher, who is an American comedian, apparently. I did not know who he was before reading this book, and now that I know who he is, I honestly don't care. But that's okay. Essentially, When You Run Alone, You Ride Bin Laden is a series of political essays written by Bill Maher, which initially covers sort of his plans or his, like, you know, thoughts on what the government should do following the event of 9/11, but also includes a lot of other of his, like, political leanings, including legalizing marijuana and, like, a few other things. And I thought it was okay. I'm not particularly, like, I am a very political person. That is entirely something that I am very truthful about, you know. I am politically active as much as I can be. I try to be more politically active, but, you know, obviously politics involves an emotional investment that I am not always ready for. And sometimes I kind of just need to, like, you know, self-care and not deal with the outside world as much. But that's neither here nor there. But, you know, I thought the book was okay. Like, I agreed with most of the things that he said. I believe that he had a decent enough nuance on his opinions about, I guess, jihad terrorism, that some people said that, like, in the book was Islamophobic, and I can definitely see that interpretation. Like I said, I think there was enough nuances separated from that, but I also think that, like, you know, it is a delicate line that one has to toe when discussing political things, especially in that context. And I think, like, you know, as the book is, it is by this point outdated, as any book on politics would be 20 years later. It honestly doesn't cover things, like, you know, that came out after, like, the events, like, you know, what is it called? Essentially, the thing that allows us. The Patriot Act. Thank you. I couldn't think of the name of it. But yeah, like, it doesn't, like, cover the Patriot Act. He doesn't cover, like, a lot of things. Or, like, things that he talks about, like, I guess, like, TSA, like, surveillance. Were, like, you know, thought about, but they had not been, like, you know, implemented yet by the time of his writing. There was, like, you know, a few other, there's, like, you know, some decent, like, you know, opinions to have. But at the same time, like, you know, there was ones that just did not hit as much. And there was also I can't find it in here right now. But, like, you know, there was also this, like, okay, boomer moment where I'm just like, okay, boomer, we get it, you hate millennials, like, we suck, whatever. But one thing that was kind of interesting is that he essentially, he, like, did make some good notes, like, our dependence on, I guess, foreign oil and stuff like that. But, let's stop talking about, like, you know, his political opinions and actually get onto this thing. One thing that was interesting is that he essentially did it for a series. Each essay came with a sort of political poster that he made, a lot of them based off of, like, old World War II posters, and basically talked about patriotism and stuff. It was interesting. I give it 3 stars. Like, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't my thing, you know? And I definitely, like, I only agreed with about 80% of, like, what he said. So, I guess, like, I guess you could say, like, wow, Ryan, you judge, like, people's politics and based on whether or not you agree with them, but it's like, everyone bases politics on whether or not they agree with people. That is human nature. But let's move on to something which isn't derisive and political. So basically not the channel, I'm just kidding. So, I thought it was interesting. I mostly just picked it up because it was, like, so weird looking, and I'm just like, well, I gotta. And around that time, I wanted to start doing more reading on just food writers. I was reading Will Write for Food around that time by Diane Jacobs, and they were talking about M.F.K. Fisher, who, if you guys don't know, was a very famous American food writer in the 60s and 70s and, like, you know, so on and so forth. And they were very prolific and essentially one of the backbones of American food writing. And so I'm like, you know, I'm a cook, but I'm also a food writer. And so I wanted to make sure that if I'm going to be continuing, like, you know, this, I guess, evocation, if you will, that I should, like, you know, definitely read some of the greats, really understand a great feel for the literary genre. And so I picked up a memoir by M.F.K. Fisher called Sister Age. It was actually written in 1983, if you guys give a shit, which you might not, who cares. And so essentially I thought, like, it would be about food writing. Was like really excited about that. It's a different take. It's not really that much about food in general. It's more about M.F.K. Fisher kind of coming to age with, like, coming to term with her, like, aging body. Because, like, she was getting up there. She was kind of, like, feeling her mortality. And she wanted to really write a book that kind of, like, talked about just all, sort of, I guess, like, aging and old people and death and all of these, like, different things. And so it was a series of short stories about that, essentially. I gave it 3 stars. It was not bad. I liked M.F.K. Fisher's writing style for the most part. Some of the short stories went on for really long, but there was also ones that were written in a very similar style to, like, the boring segments that I found absolutely captivating. She has this very sort of slow, sort of gentle, like, way of flowing through a narrative and just sort of, like, describing things. And it's very peaceful at times, which I really enjoyed. Like, there's this very reminiscent or nostalgic sort of air to a lot of her, like, stories. And so I enjoyed it, but as an introduction to M.F.K. Fisher, it left me a little bit wanting more. I think just, anthology work is always a tricky subject, and because of the fact that it's very piecemeal in the stories and there's not always as much cohesion, you can definitely have some stories which drag down the mean, So there were some really great stories. There was this really wonderful one where she was talking about the oldest man in France, basically, and she basically stayed with him in this his house for like a week or something. It's very Heidi-esque. Like, she literally goes around this huge hill, and she talked a lot about, like, the food they ate and everything else, and it was so peaceful, and I love stories that have a very strong tie into the environment. Like I said, like, Heidi, like, stuff like that is just, it gets me. I really love stories that describe those things. She also had, like, a couple sort of ghost stories in the book, which I thought were, like, really interesting. Just kind of, like, the ghost was, like, kind of the twist. And I'm like, okay, like, that was fun, because I wasn't expecting some more sort of, like, supernatural or fantastical element in a memoir about aging. And so those were actually, like, really well written, and I like those as well. And so I didn't dislike the book, but at the same time, like, it's not what I wanted from M.F.K. Fisher. And that's really on me, but, still, 3 stars. Yeah. So, this is the second thriller that I read, and it was Turn of the Key by Ruth Ware. And so I had initially started another Ruth Ware book earlier in my reading, and that was Woman in Cabin 10, which I DNF'd. But, so I was a little hesitant with Ruth Ware, but it's like, I really love the idea of the story. Essentially, this nanny named Rowan gets a job to be a live-in caretaker for 3 children, like, up in Scotland. And so she's like, okay. She gets to the manor, it's this sort of, like, high-tech smart house, but then creepy shit starts happening. And so you basically learn from, like, the beginning of the book that she's writing, like, she's sort of remembering these events as they happen, because she's writing a letter to this barrister, or lawyer, if you're American like me, who she's trying to convince that she did not murder a child. So you know from the beginning that a child dies sometime during the story, and that she is essentially framed or convicted of the murder. And so she's trying to essentially explain her innocence through this story. So I like it because, in a sense, it's epistolary, though it's not, I guess, it's kind of like one of those epistolary novels where it begins as that, with, like, your dear Evan Hansen or whatever, but then, like, slowly devolves into just essentially basically prose. But at the same time, like, so it sort of fades into a conventional story. And I really enjoyed it, actually. I thought it was a really good thriller. Some of the elements that I enjoyed was that it was very gothic. Not heavily gothic aesthetic-wise, but it definitely drew a lot on gothic literature. If you don't know, Turn of the Key is very clearly an homage to Henry James's Turn of the Screw, which was essentially the story of a caretaker taking care of these children in, like, an old mansion, and they were being haunted by the ghost of a former employee. And so it is, like, obviously there's some very strong, like, gothic elements, a lot of little homages, which I thought were clever because I like gothic literature. And so I just really enjoyed it. I also liked how they had a modern setting for a gothic book, because I like when people put refreshing takes onto older genres. I also thought, plot-wise, the thriller was very well wrapped up. At least for me. I know some people I've heard reviewers said they did not like how Turn of the Key ended. They did not like how it was sort of like wrapped up. But I found it very satisfying, and I found the ending gut-wrenching, which is all I'm going to give you because as a thriller, plot is important and spoilers can really ruin your experience of a book like that. So let's move on because we have a lot of books to review. And that is American Gods by Neil Gaiman. This is another book I really, really wanted to read for the longest time. Ever since I found out about it on, when it became a TV show. So Neil Gaiman is a really prolific British English author, I should say. He wrote The Graveyard Book. He's also the artist, or at least writer, for the Sandman series. So he is very famous. He's also married to Amanda Palmer. If you guys don't know, you've heard me mention her. I love her music. Anyway, American Gods is essentially a fantasy novel that also employs elements of sort of the road trip genre and a few other elements. It follows the life of Shadow, who is a ex-convict person of color, who is essentially working for a mysterious man named Mr. Wednesday after his wife and best friend die in a car accident because his wife was giving some head to his best friend and that's what caused the car accident. So, not the best thing to happen when you just got released out of prison, folks. But some things I really loved about the story is that essentially it's kind of like an adult version of Percy Jackson. It's following sort of the immigration of gods and other sort of celestial beings to America, which is, in a sense, godless in, the narrative of the story. And so the old gods are essentially about to start a giant war with the new gods, which are kind of these embodiments of things like technology and mass media and the internet and stuff like that. And so there's a really interesting divide, and it's such an inventive novel. I say novel even though it's 600 pages, so it's a big fat book. But if you're basically just looking for a more mature version of Percy Jackson or anything else that Rick Riordan ever wrote, this is definitely the type of story that you want to read. It has a really strong it has just a fantastic amount of research done to it. Neil Gaiman really knew his shit when he wrote this. And so you get so many different sort of personifications and depictions of so many different sort of pantheons and religions and gods. And so there's just all these little details that just really expand and flesh out the world. And just all these really tiny details that just make the world so satisfying. There's also, for the work, there's actually a decent amount of LGBT rep. Let's see, one of the main characters is bisexual, and there's other smaller LGBT depictions throughout the novel. Shadow, and I guess Mr. Wednesday are straight, so it's none of the main characters are LGBT, but they're all there is LGBT inclusion, which I liked that they depicted that, especially for a fantasy series, which you don't really see the gays in the fantasy series, And I'm looking to see if I listed it because I put all of my books on a shelf in Goodreads, but because I'm trash at updating it immediately after I do it, none of these are in order. But I remember that I gave that 5 stars because I loved the book. It was fantastic. It was everything I ever hoped for, and I love it. So that's all you really need to know. Next up, I listened to the second audiobook in The Dark Worlds of H.P. Lovecraft. And this anthology covered, give me a second, Horror over Innsmouth, very, very, just ultimate Lovecraft, very famous, one of his, most cited works, and a earlier one called Dago, which is actually one of his earliest short stories. I believe it was made in 1935. So that was actually the earliest work that I've read, during the quarantine, and it was okay. I didn't care much for the short story just because it was part of Lovecraft's juvenilia, so it just was not as, fleshed out as some of his later work, and so it kind of felt like he was repeating a lot of motifs I've already seen in his work. So it wasn't as impactful. It has some good imagery, just not as impactful. But Horror of Innsmouth was actually really good. I like that there was actually some action elements to it, which really helped spice up just a lot of the more subtle, passive horror of Lovecraft's work. So I like that. I gave it 3 stars just because, like, once again, it was good, but the audiobook just really did not make it amazing for me. It was not the best way for me to consume his work, I should say. So next up, I read my second physical book of this quarantine, and that was Embedded by Dan Abnett. So Dan Abnett is actually a comic book writer, but he's also written 3 standalone novels, which I thought was really interesting. So Embedded is essentially a sci-fi novel, like, you know, set in a sort of post-colonialized universe. So this is like one of those sci-fi ones where, like, you know, America, wow, that's really ethnocentric. Humans have essentially expanded past Earth, colonized the stars, and, like, you know, we're pretty deep into the space colony era. And so he is on planet, let's see, 86, so the 86th planet that has been colonized, and he is following this man named Faulkner? Falk. Like Guy Fawkes. But just as F-A-L-K. Anyway, he's a veteran journalist, and he's basically trying to get to the bottom of some conflicts that have been happening between bloc control governments and the capitalist governments, which are pretty much the U.S. So essentially imagine a... Give me a second. Trying to think of a good elevator pitch. Essentially imagine a boots-on-the-ground war novel that was set up during the Cold War, but in a hard sci-fi colonial setting. If that sounds good to you, then, like, you know, that's definitely, like, you know, something you should read. I really enjoyed it because I like the sci-fi elements because they were decently fleshed out. They had, like, you know, a good world building in that sense. But it also was just a really satisfying war fiction, which I'm not, like, usually someone who picks up war fiction. There are a few war, like, you know, novels that I've really enjoyed, like Things They Carry. But it's never something that I'm initially drawn to. But it was really well done. It has just some really great elements to it. And as, like, you know, standalone sci-fi novels go, I really enjoyed picking this up. I was expecting this to be a lot more pulpy than, like, you know, it really was. And so this was a solid read. I give this 4 stars. So moving on, I read another horror classic, We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. This is probably one of her, like, most well-known works, along with The Haunting of Hill House. I picked this up mostly just because I really wanted to get into Jackson after The Haunting of Hill House and We Have Always Lived in the Castle had movie and television adaptations, respectively. Hill House had a TV show, Castle had a movie. Anyway. And so I really enjoyed it. It was a bit short, as novels go, so I guess you could possibly call this a novella. I think that would be accurate. But what's it about, Ryan? So it follows a girl named Maricat. She's 18 years old, I believe it's mentioned. And she essentially lives with her sister Constance and her uncle Julian in their house after their family dies horrendously from cyanide poisoning. And so it's a very intimate sort of gothic-style novel that just deals with ideas of isolation and family value. And sort of like isolation and ostracization and just, like, you know, the love of family and what we'll do for them and things like that. And I really love Jackson's way of just writing, because one thing you really need to understand to kind of understand Jackson's work is that she is kind of listed as a writer of terror as opposed to horror. A really good way of understanding this is that terror is essentially the anticipation of... So terror and horror are sort of, like, you know, connected very tightly. Terror is essentially the anticipation of the event, while horror is the realization of it. I like to think of it as, imagine you hear a bump in the night and you look underneath the bed. The initial moments before you see what is underneath the bed and you are anticipating the worst is the sense of terror. Horror is when you see something that is what you're expecting. So if you look under the bed and it's some creepy ghost girl, that's horror. The moment before is terror. If there's nothing there, it's relief. But let's just stop discussing emotions and discuss if I liked the book. Loved it. I thought it was really good. I listened to it as an audiobook, and it was great. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can really say about it. I know it won't be everyone's cup of tea, but if you like sort of more subtle horror stories, really something you should, read. It's just, it's good. I gave it 5 stars. So next up, I read probably one of my most favorite books of the period, and that was My Life in France by Julia Child and Alex Prudhomme. And Prudhomme is actually Child's grandnephew, so they are related, which I thought was interesting. I listened to this as an audiobook, and I did love it. However, I do want to eventually get a physical copy of it, because there are epistolary elements within the book that I would have loved to have seen. Child recreated the French book, as she called it. It's actually really interesting how long she wanted to write this book. It was actually on one of the last books she wrote before she died, actually. Essentially, she used a bunch of letters that she and her husband wrote to, their family during their life in France, and all these other elements. And so there's a lot of different sort of real-world pieces of media throughout the book that sort of, connect with the story. Also, the physical book has a complete index of all of the dishes mentioned in the story, and I'm just like, we know I got it. And so, I really loved it. Child is definitely an inspiration to me as a cook. She always has been. That and Betty Crocker, despite the fact that she is completely fictional. And so, I love Julia Child. I remember, turning on PBS, seeing, My French Chef, and Julia Child was just like, today, bitches, we making creme brulee. And I'm like, okay, I know when that is because I'm 8. And she just pulls out a freaking blowtorch and goes, boom, bitch. And I'm like, I want to be that cool. I want to make creme brulee with the blowtorch. Damn it, now I want creme brulee. But pretty much what's the story about, right? You just gushing over Child. It's essentially following Julia Child as she first starts getting into her cooking life. So if you don't know, Julia Child first started cooking when she was in her 50s, I believe. Very much later into her life. And it wasn't until, and for the rest of her life, she established a career as both a cookbook writer and as a television celebrity through cooking. And so it basically talks about her going to France with her husband because they both were in the military. Or they worked for the government. They worked for the government, but also in a military capacity. I don't remember the exact department they were in, but essentially they worked as public relations for a bunch of different, things. And that's how they met, that's how they got married, and eventually after the war, they moved to France as part of her husband's promotion to a public media outlet of the government. And so she basically talks about her discovering cooking, enrolling in the Cordon Bleu, which if you don't know is a very prestigious French cooking school, which does have branches in the United States. We actually used to have one in Portland, however it was closed down a few years ago. And it just keeps, and it continues. She talks about basically meeting a lot of her friends throughout life that were part of her cooking experience. She wrote about how she co-wrote Mastering the Art of French Cooking, how she basically got on television, how she just all these different things, and it was absolutely inspirational. It reminded me, it was really relatable to me as a cook, and it also reminded me of a lot of why I enjoy cooking in general. And I just really loved the way Child spoke, just her personality, and it was just fantastic. It reminds me why I love Julia Child so much, and it just really inspired me as a cook, which I think that all good food writing should do. You should always want to inspire you to either eat or get in the kitchen to make somebody else eat. And it just did that. So I rated that another 5 stars because I've just been having the best time with my reading experience lately. Next up was, you've heard this one a lot on BookTube, Red, White, and Royal Blue by Kesey McQuiston. Queston. And so, what's it about, Ryan? Red, White, and Royal Blue is a male-male romance involving the first son of the President of the United States, who, by the way, is a woman in this story, and not a living Cheeto who's horribly racist, and the Prince of Wales. So, and, they kind of don't really like each other that much. Until some shit happens, they basically have to become fake friends. And then they realize they want a bone, and the story continues. And so, I fucking love this novel. I wasn't sure because it sounded a bit ish, but I read it, and it was fantastic. It was really funny, actually. It had McQuiston has a great sense of comedy, and it really works. And I feel that, a lot of the jokes were sort of, more for my era, my generation, but, it really, resounded with me. I really like the chemistry between the two like guys. Alex is, I especially love that like at the beginning it's very enemies to lovers. Alex has the hugest hate boner for what's his face, Henry, yeah, and it's just. I love when characters just like when they first start out in a romance novel, they cannot stand the other person. They're just like, you're a piece of shit, and like they just have like, and it's just like I love it because like they hate them so much that you start thinking, the gentleman doth protest too much, you know. And I love enemies to lovers as a trope, and so it works out. And this book was just really wholesome. It really was. Besides the great chemistry, besides like, you know, just the comedy of it, besides just, there was some steamy stuff in it. Like, as a romance go, it gives you just the good amount of like, it was good, like, there was equal parts like smut and romance, which is what I want in a romance novel. Like, you ain't gonna like, you're gonna have a romance novel like, yeah, I want them to kiss, but I also want them to bang. Like, that is what we want in a romance novel. And there's that. Not as explicit as, like, you know, I expected it to be, but then I remembered that there's a difference between romance and erotica, and I'm just like, oh, that's why it's not horrible. Like, that's why they aren't giving, like, giant descriptions of every, like, detail. And then I'm like, okay, this is still good. And so, like, it's also just, like I said, super wholesome. I keep reading this and I'm thinking, wow, I live in the worst timeline. Like, why do I have to deal with racist Cheeto man when we could have, like, you know, a Latina businesswoman running the White House? Okay, like, why can't we? Like, I want that timeline, okay? Like, that would be, like, 2020 best year instead of 2020 worst year, okay? And I'm trying to think of this. I had so much, like, to say about this book, and it's, like, going all out of my head now, so give me a fat second to gather my thoughts. And now my mind just went blank. I really enjoyed this book. I just thought there were so many great things about it. Two small caveats before I do finish up on talking about it. The one small issue I had with the book was that it took forever, and I feel bad for critiquing this because I know that McQuiston did use a lot of her own experiences as a bisexual woman in writing these scenes. But it felt that, like, Alex took forever to really accept his bisexuality. Which I'm like, oh no, it's a spoiler, but bitch, this is a male-male romance. You know he was getting that dick eventually. And he literally, like, you know, he makes out with, like, you know, the dude. And he's like, wow, that was super hot. And then he's like, oh wait, is I the gaze? And, like, you know, he's just, like, racking his brain. He's like, you know, you can see the smoke rising. And he spends, like, a chapter and a half with this question. And, like, he's talking to all of his friends, and he's just like, hey, quick round table. Do you think I'm a homosexual? And so he's just, like, listening to all this input, and he's just like, well, I don't think I am. I mean, I did stick my tongue down that guy's throat. And, like, you know, I had this, like, you know, super best friend, and, like, you know, high school, and, like, you know, we totally made out sometimes, and gave each other handies, and, like, looked deeply into each other's eyes, and I'm thinking, yeah, that sounds pretty gay, fam. Just, like, you know, get with this dude. This is what we are reading the story for. And then it, like, calls up the guy, and he's like, hey, was it gay? And it's like, dude, I'm with my boyfriend, and duh. And it's like, oh, I guess I'm a bisexual. Ooh-hoo. I'm sure you don't get that reference. Anyway, and I'm just like his friend said when he asked her about it, I was in college, I touched a titty. It wasn't that profound. Ain't nobody gonna be writing an off-Broadway play about it. And I'm just like, kinda true, Alex. You made out of a dude. You liked it. Shit ain't that deep, fam. Okay, just like, chase that boy. Lock him down. And it's just, I felt the scene, like, kind of drew out a bit too much. I thought it was important. I definitely think it set up some subplots that were important. But it's like, shit ain't that deep, you know? And maybe that's just me. Like, you know, obviously, if you have a different experience, if you thought that, like, you know, the scene was really, really heartfelt and profound and deep for you, tell me down below. I want to hear your opinion. Another small caveat, and this is not one that I had, but this is something that I heard from another booktuber, and I wanted to share it since, like, you know, I thought that that was a very interesting opinion and that was important. So, I can't remember if I've mentioned it before when yeah, I can't remember if I mentioned it before, but Alex is Hispanic, or Latino, whatever you want to call it. And so I was watching Bow Ties and Books' review of this book, and she said that the Mexican rep was not as accurate or as well fleshed as it could be. I don't remember her exact words on it, but she basically, paraphrasing, said the rep was trash. I don't know myself since I am soy blanco, but just food for thought, I'm not really sure if, the representation is great. It is there, but if you have, your own opinions on whether or not it was a good representation of a Latino character, I would love to hear your opinion on that. So, moving on, I read another nonfiction book. It was 5 Love Languages by Gary Chapman. If you don't know, love languages are basically these different ways you can express, how you love people. So you can give gifts, or say nice things, or spend time with them. It's pretty basic. It has been around, it's old hat by now in the realm of armchair/pop psychology. But, I saw it, I'm just okay, I could use a fun read. I want to listen to some nonfiction because I'm doing yard work. And so I pop it in my earbuds. And it was okay. On a self-help, pop psychology level, the theory is fairly sound. I mean, it's some people have criticized the book to be kind of common sense. Everyone has different ways they like to appreciate love, but it's sometimes the obvious needs to be stated. And I think that is a good groundwork to actually dealing with, these elements. So he has an idea, he has theory, he explains how to, work with it. That way, it's good. It's it's well explained. My main issues are just kind of, I don't want to say the datedness of the book, because I don't think that books should be exempt from, not being inclusive or diverse simply because they're older. Because, literally there are older books that have LGBT and black characters. For instance, think Most Crime Noir. That shit has a lot of LGBT up, and a good amount of people of color. So it's not age dictates whether or not someone has a diverse or LGBT inclusive work. But why am I mentioning LGBT inclusivity and racial diversity? Mostly, love languages comes off very heteronormative, and that is just the god honest truth. Pretty much every single one of the examples given in all these marriages are very basic, very trad wife sort of depictions of marriage. You have the husband as the breadwinner, you have the wife as the domestic partner, and it's always the same, and it just almost goes into stereotypical, 1950s housewife bullshit, Every single story almost, reads geez, my wife's mad at me because I don't mow the lawn and put the toilet seat down. And then, the wife's just my husband never spends any time with me and he's always playing golf or hunting or some bullshit. And I'm just okay, whatever. And Chapman just does not spend any time really talking about any sort of other non-heteronormative relationship or how that, might affect, the relationship at all. So they don't mention the gays, they don't mention the lesbians. And another real interesting point, that he doesn't mention polyamory at all, which I thought was such an interesting point. I saw in a review that I didn't think about it initially when I read it, but I was reading reviews on it, and they mentioned that. I thought that was really important, because now I'm not polyamorous myself, I'm very monogamous, but I do know that a lot of polyamorous couples use the polyamory as a way of getting a full amount of emotional support. That different partners meet different emotional and physical needs for that one person, and that's the reason why they have different partners. That some polyamorous, I shouldn't say all, some polyamorous believe that to have a completely full and complete life, that they will have multiple partners to meet all of their needs, and that one person shouldn't have to meet all of their emotional and physical needs. And I think that's a really good point. And I think there are definitely examples beyond that, where one might want to have a polyamorous relationship. For instance, if somebody has, a very strong romantic relationship, but they have sort of fringe sexual needs that the first partner does not feel comfortable doing, feel comfortable performing, or is just not really their kink. And so I could totally understand a polyamorous relationship where they would have, a very tight-knit, very personal and intimate romantic and sexual relationship, but then there's also, somebody on the side that, whips them and calls them a bitch. I can completely imagine that happens. And Chapman doesn't talk about polyamorous relationships. He doesn't really talk about anything that isn't very traditionally trad wife. Very much the husband's the breadwinner, the wife is a housewife, Another element I disliked in the book was that it was strangely proselytizing in a way that I did not appreciate. Now, I'm a religious person myself. I don't mind people discussing religious doctrine or theory in books. I actually have a lot of respect for books that do have spiritual characters. However, if I'm reading a self-help book, especially one that is not meant to be a devotional or have anything to do with the Christian faith or other faiths for that matter, I don't really want to mix my jam with my jelly, you know? If I'm reading a secular work, I expect to have secular discussion. If I'm reading a religious work, I expect religious discussion. Obviously, I'd be fine if a work, had both secular and ecclesiastical, writing in it. But generally, if I'm reading something for secular purposes, I want to have a secular discussion. And Chapman has a lot of Christian doctrine within his work. He quotes the scripture quite a few times, and in one chapter, actually encourages people to convert to Christianity, which, once again, if this was a devotional, I would not have an issue with. But this is a pop psychology book about how to get your wife to stop nagging at you, and I just do not think it was the time nor the place for it. I think if you want to evangelize, you should write religious fiction or nonfiction, and not write a pop psychology book to hide your massive boner for Jesus. So, like I said before, I am religious myself, but I just did not think it was the time or place in that book. And so because of those reasons I mentioned, the heteronormativity, the trad wifeness, and sort of the proselytizing, I give it 3 stars, it had a few flaws. Next up was a short story, which I guess does it count, who knows, and that was To Be or Not to Be by Kurt Vonnegut. And it's essentially a dystopian world that deals with overpopulation, where pretty much, if you want to, you can call up, your local family, government, and get assisted suicide. Essentially, they live in a post-scarcity world where population control is completely irrelevant, because there is a set amount of people that are allowed to live in the world at any given time. And you essentially follow the story of a man who is having triplets. But because of that, he can only, unless 3 people volunteer to die, he can't keep them. So he says, his grandfather's, ready to give up his life, but that means that he has to choose which one of his children he wants to let live, and which 2 that consequently have to die because of the rules of the society. And so, I'm not going to spoil what happens, but that's the general premise. It's very short, but like a lot of other Vonnegut short stories, it presents a really fascinating dystopian outlook. What I really enjoy about Vonnegut is that he has these very sort of cerebral ideas of, what a world can, are just, very out there sort of futures that we wouldn't really think about, but are just absolutely fascinating. And so I really enjoyed reading it. I literally just picked it up because it was, always available on, Libby. And I'm like, okay, I'll just read it. It looks short, and I'll see what it is. And I liked it. I'm trying to see, I think I have it right here. Let's see. I rated it 4 stars. Yeah, that sounds about right. I liked it. Wasn't the best, wasn't worst. It was good. Next up is a book that I really, really enjoyed. It was a young adult fantasy novel by Holly Black called The Coldest Girl in Cold Town. And I'm actually going to adjust. Perfect. You can actually see my face. Anyway, pretty much imagine if iZombie was a vampire novel. That's the best way to describe it. It follows the story of, really can't remember the name off the top of my head, but I'll edit it in if I can. Essentially a teenage girl who, along with her ex and this hot vampire bad boy, essentially has to go into this internment camp called a Cold Town. And she's basically dealing with, all these, different sort of societal understandings of vampires, and just trying to really survive. And so on one hand, it's very uniquely young adult, which I loved, because I don't see young adult paranormal, ever. And so we're like, okay, it's vampires, and it's, really great world building, but on the other hand, it's, this girl being all these boys, and it's great. I love the young adult elements of it. They were refreshing, and they were really well done. I also love the vampiric world building of the story. There was just so many layers to it. There was such an organic way that the world was introduced and developed. And overall, it was just a fantastic work. The only other time I've read Holly Black is with the Spiderwick Chronicles, which I loved. And so, not knowing that she had written young adult before, I was initially surprised and amazed by this novel. I really loved it. It was great. Definitely suggest you read it. Also, one thing that I did want to mention that I really loved about it was that it just had some great cash LGBT rep. One of the main characters is just super fucking bi, and it has nothing to do with the story, she's just oh, by the way, that dude also likes dudes. And I'm just okay, let's get it. Get that LGBT rep. there's also a trans character in this novel, which, like, also at the same time, it's just like, hey, I'm trans, and I'm just like, and literally, there's no consequences. They're just living their best life, being queer AF, and we stand. And I really enjoyed that for a book that came out in 2013, that you actually have LGBT rep in a young adult novel. And it's just, it was lovely. It was a really good book, and I really enjoyed it. And it's one of the books that I probably want to buy when all of this is said and done. So moving on, I read another young adult novel. This was a thriller this time. And you might hate me for this, but it was One of Us Was Lying by Karen McManus. And I only gave her 3 stars. And I'm going to tell you why right now. So on one hand, I liked reading the story. Actually, I should probably give you a sort of like description of what the book's about. Pretty much it's a, I believe somebody called it, I'm trying to remember, Pretty Little Liars meets The Breakfast Club. I don't remember who said that, but somebody did it as a good description of it. You basically get all of this sort of like, cyberbullying, I'm going to reveal your secrets and tell everyone you're a slut, like, plot line. But then you get like, oh my goodness, all of these stereotypes actually have a personality, Breakfast Club thing. And so it combines those 2 elements. And I enjoyed it. It was easy to read, and it was like, it flowed well. But at the same time, there's a bunch of elements that I didn't care for in the story. So first off, the characters were just so tied into the tropes that it was a little hard to really have good character development. Because I just feel that what was her name? McManus, sorry. I just feel like McManus just played just so on the nose for every single one of her characters that it was a little hard to really enjoy them outside of their perceived, I guess, identity. And I talked about this a bit before about my issues with, like, just the whole jock nerd cliches in high school literature and, like, my reading vlog about this. But it is a little bit of a prevalent issue. Pretty much, like, all of the characters, like, Big Secrets kind of ties into their already established tropes. And I would have appreciated more a version of the stereotypes in the story. The characters were still developed, they were still personable, but at the same time they were very trope-heavy, which could be not the best. Another element that I just wasn't the happiest for was probably the representation. There was a small amount of representation in the novel. One of the main characters is Latina, another one of the main characters is gay, and it feels a bit tokenistic. I'm okay with, like, a character being, like, a person of color and not having that be a gigantic part of their identity and not having that be, like, the most important thing to their, like, character arc. But I also like to see how one's racial identity or one's heritage plays into, like, how they see the world or sort of, like, their family, like, dynamics. Because that's part of the thing that makes it really interesting. The languages you speak, the food you eat, the sort of, like, culture your parents and grandparents consume. All of that is an interesting part of your life. And I like to see them in characters. I like to know that not every character watches the same shows I watch and does the same things that I do. I also just wasn't, like, super into the LGBT rep as well. They have a gay character, but at the same time, they don't really do much with his story. And I was thinking about, like, why I just disliked how the story is progressing. And I realized that in the story, there's consequences, but there really isn't. Everything that happens to the characters is very sort of told to us rather than shown. And the consequences of, I guess, having their secrets exposed is almost laughably minimal. Essentially, they get lightly bullied, but that basically just means that they get a tight-knit friend group of people that actually support them that are outside of, the 4 people that are, like, part of this story. And I just realized I didn't actually tell you the actual plot of the book. I just sort of, like, gave you a sort of, like, blurb. Pretty much there's these 4 kids, they're in detention. There's this guy who's, like, kind of the Pretty Little Liars aspect, and he, like, tells secrets about people. And he dies, and they're all kind of, like, framed for his murder. Anyway, so, like, and they're dealing with the consequences of this stuff as, like, the criminal investigation proceeds, and they're trying to figure out, like, who actually did it. So, sorry, actual plot synopsis, let's just on back to, like, what I don't like about it. And it's just, there's these consequences, but they're, like, not really. Everything works out in the end, and none of the characters really lose anything of value to themselves. If anything, they gain more things in the book than they actually lose. And it's like, if you're going to have a story where there's supposedly real-life consequences for these secrets coming out, I should really be able to feel the impact of the consequences. So like I said, one of the characters is gay. That is his secret, which some people dislike, I guess, sexuality be considered a secret or being something that's shocking to reveal. But there are plenty of people out there in the closet, and I think that is a reasonable and understandable trope to play off, and that is something that somebody might want to keep hidden. Anyway, keep gathering my thoughts about it. One thing I dislike is that there are consequences for him, like, for essentially him being outed, which is its own level of bullshit. But they're very minimal and almost laughable in a sense. Because I can understand, like, in the story, if he would deal with some, like, actual issues that would happen to a person that came out as, like, homosexual. Or rather was outed as someone who was homosexual. Like, for instance, him being, like, ostracized in his sports team, which can be very homophobic. Due to a lot of, like, fragile, like, masculinity. Like, that is an issue that many, like, men in sports have to deal with, especially with regards of homosexuality. Or him being kicked out of his house, or having, like, more ostracization of his family. Pretty much the only effect of him being, like, outed as gay is just, like, resident mean girl Vanessa, who is just pretty much in the story to be a bitch when the plot demands it. It's like, she starts off some shit in the cafeteria. He walks in, all the people in, like, the school are just like, oh, look who it is, Mr. Homosexual. And Vanessa's, like, at the forefront of it. And I see this scene, and I'm thinking, is he the only gay kid in this very big high school? I'm sorry, McManus, this was written in 2017. Does this high school not have a GSA? Is this the only queer man in this entire school? That doesn't seem realistic. I'm sorry, there are more gays in the world than one person in a 2,000 school population. It's like, it is not realistic in today's society to have this very weird heckling and gay bashing in the novel, because it wasn't even good. If you're going to have a bullying scene, please, for the life of God, actually have some good, like, I guess taunts, insults. It's like, I'm seeing this and I'm just like, and then this is just like, I bet you suck dick and like it. And I'm thinking, yeah, dude, you know that, Vanessa. That's not an insult. That's just a description of what he likes to do on a Saturday night. Like, can you try harder to be a bitch? Because that's kind of your purpose in this story. And yeah, there was, like, issues like that, like I said. And because of all of that, like, it was a interesting read. Oh, one more point. The ending was kind of trash. It pulled a bunch of shit out of nowhere. And I felt that if the story spent more time sort of characterizing the antagonist, maybe perhaps by having a fifth perspective from the villain's point of view that actually fleshed out their motivations or some of the secondary antagonists' motivations, it would have been a much more stronger ending. But because of the way it was written, because of the focus on, like, the quadrary protagonists, it just did not really hold water. There was a bit of some twists, and it was really out of the blue, and it was not great. And because of the really shitty ending, which also kind of punches down mental illness, I give it 3 stars. It had some big problems in it, but it was a read. It was easy to read, So moving on, we did have some great LGBT rap in one of its slang, but the next one is fantastic. Do you like epistolary novels about time-traveling lesbians? Because I sure do. And that's why I got to read This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal, El-Mohtah, and Max Gladstone. Hopefully I pronounced your name correctly, Amal. I do apologize if I did not. So, How to Lose the Time War is essentially a epistolary novel between 2 time-traveling agents who are both women, and they basically start a sort of romantic relationship through this letter writing. And it's fantastic. It's this really just great and thought, like, look at all these, like, different places and time as, like, the time traveling and doing the time traveling missions. And this all told through these letters, like, in all these, like, different ways. And they're not all conventional letters, They start off that way, but then they begin to get more sort of esoteric, like The Flight of a Bumblebee, or The Taste of a Huckleberry, or just all these other really strange ways of interpreting data that they can do because they're, like, super futuristic, like, superhumans, but that we wouldn't be able to. And so it was beautiful, it was heart-wrenching, it was incredibly poetic, and it was just some good shit. Like, I was reading it and I did not want to put it down. And I'm not usually that way about books. Like, I love reading books. But sometimes I get bored. Like, no, I wanted to, like, keep reading it. Like, I had to stop reading it. I felt sad. Like, it was some of the best shit I read. Like, 5 stars. Absolutely. Why aren't you reading this? Yes. Read it right now. It's great. Next up was another fantastic book. And that was Freshwater by Iwaki Imizi. And I was like reading the book and I thought it sounded really interesting from the description. I also knew that it was from a non-binary by BIPOC. Do you pronounce it like that? I hope that's how you pronounce the acronym. And I'm just like, let's get that bread. And so essentially Freshwater follows the story of Ada, who is a non-binary person. They're a non-binary person who essentially experiences multiple personalities. But specifically, the story is told through sort of that sense, through a very specific cultural lens, which I thought was really fascinating. Essentially, I'm trying to remember the exact word. Ubangi. I always stop with it because I always want to say the thing. Essentially, Ada has what is called Ubangi, which are these types of malevolent spirit in Igbo culture, which are essentially born to the same parents over and over again, and generally the babies die, and they get reborn, and they die, and they get reborn. And because of this essentially drives their parents into financial crisis, or poverty, like what have you. It's essentially a giant toll on these people, and is part of the Igbo's mythology. And so there's actually a lot of specific reasons like why the Ubangi do this, and it's tied into like a lot of their spiritual and religious beliefs. But I am not Igbo. I am not a historian or theologian in African religions, and so I can't really get into the details of why. But essentially, they're dealing with multiple personalities throughout their life. They feel a collective self, and until essentially this really horrible trauma happens to them in college, they constantly see themselves as Ada, who is, I believe, presented as feminine. However, Ada does also have other personalities which present as masculine or feminine or non-binary, and so they are non-binary, gender fluid, whatever have you. I believe they identify as non-binary in the book, but anyway. And essentially, it just deals with their life and all of the sort of like traumas that they deal with until they can eventually find sort of their spiritual awakening by understanding that they are Ubangi, that they are a collective we in like human form, and that's how they find their piece of their existence. And it's such a great book. It's incredibly poetic. It's incredibly just so well written and so unique. And it deals with a lot of really fucked up shit. But because of the writing style of the sort of like, disassociated state that it's written in, it's almost as if you're looking at a lot of this stuff is described as if it's happening to a person that you're seeing through the eyes of but not emotionally connecting with, like literally disassociation. And it's so well written. I think it deals with mental illness, it deals with gender identity, it deals with sexuality, it deals with abuse, it deals with like so many different concepts so well. And there's just so many elements that I absolutely love about it. Despite its depictions of mental illness and all these other things, it also has a really interesting focus on religion. There is a lot of discussion of Ada as they essentially lose their Catholic faith and also regain it during their lives, while also discussing other religions such as their Igbo spirituality and also Afro-Caribbean religions as well. I don't believe they ever mention essentially which Afro-Caribbean religion, because there are several which are closely tied, but one of her best friend is, has Sane, she speaks of Lao, and so, it is part of that, I guess, interconnected group of religions. And so I just really enjoyed all of, that sort of spirituality of the character, along with the other discussions of mental health and self-harm and other issues. So, going into the book, do be warned that there is a lot of content warning. There is a lot of stuff that if you are wary of that type of thing, please look up into it. Please be careful reading it because it is very disturbing. There's a lot of trauma in it. And if you aren't comfortable or not really able to read of those things, you probably don't want to read it because, it's graphic. So Freshwater was probably, one of the most just insightful, one of the most, I guess, impactful books that I read during this time period, and I really, really loved it. Please, if you can, read this book. It's fantastic. Imezi has written several other books of which I want to get to. They are all super amazing, Everyone talks about them on BookTube, and she is so worth the hype. Sorry, my bad. They are so worth the hype. So, moving on, I got into something which was trash, and I hated it. Also, sadly enough, this was the only book that I read that was actually published this year. So, real great run 2020. You know, my sampling bias of one book. And that was Have You Seen Me by Kate White. And I'm so disappointed by this book because the premise was really good. Essentially, Have You Seen Me is a story of this woman whose name I forgot already because she doesn't matter. Who, walks into her place of work, one morning. She forgets her wallet, she forgot her car keys. Wow, it's just one of those mornings. Until she realizes, I don't work here. I haven't worked here for 5 years. Because she essentially had a dissociative fugue state and forgot about half a week of her life. And so the story is really her trying to piece together what happened in that week. And I'm like, okay, I love it. We got false narrator, we got missing time, we got stuff. What I got was mostly just a type A person worrying about every single little thing, having so much fucking drama in her, her life. And the plot was just trash. It really was. There was literally 2 separate parts in the book with 2 separate people for no reason decided to try to murder her. And you're like, okay, why? Why am I reading this? It's like, the plot just goes off the rails. And at the same time, you don't get any juicy bits. You don't get her trying to, investigate shit or, unraveling a giant conspiracy. You mostly just get her bitching about subplot, which doesn't even tie into the literal ending of the book. It's just there. And I'm like, Kate White, I don't fucking care about her family drama. I don't care about her work drama. And I don't especially care about her having a frickin' nervous breakdown every 5 minutes because she thinks her husband is cheating on her for no absolute reason. Literally, until the book, there is literally no reason why she should assume that her husband is a cheater. But she just goes on that road. She's like, I can't find his pants in the hamper. That man is a serial whore. And I'm just like, ma'am, this is a Wednesdays. Can you calm down and figure out where you were on Wednesday the 17th? Because that's why I picked up this fucking book for family. And that's why I gave it 2 stars. It was a hot dumpster fire, and I would give it less. But I'm a generous person, and I don't really know what exactly is a 1-star book for me yet. So you're lucky you didn't get less, KY. And that is the god-honest truth. You're lucky you didn't get less, because that was a terrible book, and I had to read that. I would do a rant review of that book, but that means that I would have to reread that book, and I ain't gonna suffer through that. I am not that much of a masochist. Next up, finally some good shit. The Martian Andy Ware. Loved it. What is it about, Ryan? Basically, it's a story of a man. He has a name who I've also forgotten because I'm bad with names. And he essentially gets stuck on Mars after an emergency evacuation of their habitat because essentially this is the near future where the NASA is basically trying to do missions on Mars and learn more about the planet. So we've essentially had a human Mars landing by this point. And it's so well written. I really loved just Andy Ware's writing style. It was incredibly funny. There was a great amount of humor to it. And it had this very technical, hard sci-fi edge to it. Very much like a Crichton novel, which just, as you know, Crichton's one of my favorite sci-fi authors. And so I definitely saw the sort of similarities between his work and just that very technical, very in-depth discussion of the science behind it, which was really enjoyable. There was just all these elements which really did remind me of Crichton. I know I keep comparing him to them, but there was a lot of elements that the things I love in Crichton's book, I was loving in Andy Ware's book. And it's really just what made the story great. And like I said, it was super comedic. It's just a great sci-fi story in general. And if you like the idea of Mars, if you like the idea of hard sci-fi, and you like the idea of comedic sci-fi, just read The Martian. It's great. It's worth the hype. Why aren't you reading it right now? Next up, Sota Taka Queen. And yes, I am trying to speed through these a bit because I've already been filming for an hour now. And I do want this to be at least somewhat manageable of a video to watch. I'm sorry, I read 32 books. What do you think was going to happen? Soto Taco Queen by Jennifer Torres. So, around this time, I was kind of in the mood to read something from a Latinx perspective. Because I love books like that. I really love, a lot of Hispanic culture, a lot of, other cultures under, the Latinx umbrella. And so it's I wanted to, read something that was from that perspective. And I was, looking at, and I had basically put a lot of, this year's Battle of the Books in, my sort of to-be-read folder on Libby. And I knew that this one was, up for grabs. And so I downloaded it. So, South Sotum, Dr. Queen is a middle-grade contemporary novel. And I actually really, really loved it. So, obviously, it follows the story of a girl named Steph, and her father owns a food truck, which she's a little bit embarrassed of. She doesn't want to be known as the food truck girl. She's like, Daddy, I always smell like cilantro. How dare you be, a hard-working businessman? And he's like, okay, fam, I love you too. I do everything to, put a roof above your head, but whatever. And so, a lot of the story is basically her coming to grips with not only, I guess, her own identity, but also with, just sort of, learning to accept that the food truck is part of her life, and it's part of, her not her heritage. It's part of her, I guess. I'm trying to think, what I want to use. It's part of her. It's part of her family. It's part of, I guess, just something that is unique to her family and her family's struggles. And so, I really loved it. It wasn't the most deep or complex book in the world, because it was, middle grade. But it was surprisingly wholesome. It was just so... Yeah, that was really the word for it. It's wholesome. It's just fluffy, it's warm, and it just has such great elements to it. It has these nice food writing segments. It has this really interesting subplot where essentially Steph is essentially trying to save the food truck because her father is dealing with these municipal laws that would essentially put food trucks out of business. And so she goes with him down to the city hall and does her part as a citizen. I love that they actually had that political aspect to it where she has to learn about this complex political background to owning a food truck. And then that was kind of something that she dealt with. And so I like that because you don't really see people discussing I guess civil activism in books. And I like that I was reading that in a middle grade book because that's nice. I love that there's adult elements in stories for younger children. And so I really enjoyed it. I definitely understood why it was on Battle of the Books because of its diversity, because of its story, and it was great. Next up was The Demigod Files by Rick Riordan. If you don't know, Rick Riordan writes young adult fantasy. The Demigod Files was a supplementary work for the Percy Jackson series. I don't know when exactly it was published, but from I guess the plot, it was set somewhere around the middle of the series because, if I remember correctly, Nico shows up and he was introduced in the third book. I loved Percy Jackson as a kid. I read the whole thing. It was my favorite book series growing up. And I liked the Demigod Files. They were good. But as supplementary work, there's really only so much I could enjoy it. Because, I like the short stories. I like some of the other stuff because it provided background. But it just wasn't really that impactful to me now. If I had gotten this book back when the series was coming out, back when I was obsessed with Percy Jackson and I read the first book 5 million times, I'd have been losing my shit over this. But now that I've read the entire series, now that it's concluded, now that I've read his others, most of his other series, and all this stuff has happened, I'm it was good. It was 3 stars. I enjoyed it. Next up was I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara, who, if you don't know, was married to Patton Oswalt, and this book was actually written posthumously. Basically, what happened is that... Give me a second. Essentially, the story is a true crime novel, or book, I guess it wouldn't be a novel. I think novel implies fiction. It's a true crime story that talks about the Golden State Killer, who was a prolific serial killer / serial rapist / serial vandalizer in California in the 70s and 80s. Essentially, he basically went dormant, he stopped murdering people, and eventually was actually caught several months after the publication of this book. And so the version I read actually had a postscript that actually discussed how he was, gets caught, and so it was really interesting. One thing I really loved about it was that it was one part true crime, and McNamara had this very intimate way of describing these events, really getting into not only the eyes of the killer, but also the eyes of the victims and the investigators, and having a very fly-on-the-wall approach there, where you're sort of getting all this background in sort of an Aaron Mahnke lore-esque style. Another aspect I really loved was these great memoir portions of the book, where McNamara is essentially talking about her sort of hunt and how it's affecting her psychologically, how that's affecting her family, and sort of what it means to search for a serial killer. And so I like that because even though, we have these investigative, stories, we don't always have a focus on the investigator or the reporter as well as the story itself. So it's nice to have that dual focus, if you will. There's just so many great elements about the story. It was just a fascinating, criminal case. It was a fascinating, read, and I really enjoyed it, especially since I've never read a true crime book before. So this is great. I'm really sad that McNamara did pass away because I'd have loved to have seen more novels of hers, just because it was great. Next up was The House Next Door. This is actually a series of 3 novellas written by James Patterson, and I'm just grabbing my water, and a few other people. Let me look and see what the names are. Tim Arnold, Susan DeLillo, and Max DeLillo. And so this basically covered 3 stories. The first one was House Next Door, which I didn't love. It was basically the story of a woman emotionally cheating with a drug dealer, and it was a bit trite and pulp, if I'm going to be honest. The next one, The Killer's Wife, also features a lot of cheating, this time physically and emotionally, with essentially a murder suspect's wife. And that one was decidedly better. It still was really not what I was looking for, since both of the first 2 stories were sort of posited as these very intense crime thrillers, but really just came across as kind of dry telenovelas. It was really just about a bunch of unhappy people slupping and being like, oh no, all this angst. And I'm just like, I'm not here to hear you hand-wring about fucking some dude while your husband's in jail. I'm here for that detective who should be doing his job and not sticking his dick in you to find out what those dead girls are. And the third one was called, actually, I believe I opened up the tab so I can remember the names of these, except my computer's asleep because I'm a piece of shit. So let's see. Hello, welcome to my quality channel. The third story was called, more, We Are Not Alone. Okay. And that was actually I liked it. It was a decent sci-fi novella. It had definitely sort of an 80s vibe to it, and I thought it was pretty good. So, as these short stories go along, I like them more and more. But honestly, I wasn't super appreciative of reading a 600-page book when I could have read 3 200-page books. It's okay to publish novels. No one's going to judge you if your book's short. Okay? And I don't know why this book was made. So maybe this a big, deep thing. Maybe James Patterson was super cool and all these people had cancer or something. I don't know. I don't know why this book was made. I don't understand why it was 3 novels back to back like a Reader's Digest book. But I give it 3 stars because I read it. It was a book. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't good. It was middle of the road. And that's really all I have to say about it. If you do pick up the book, I definitely would like to read We Are Not Alone, because that was a solid novel. But the other 2 were a little hit or miss for me. Luckily, the next book I read was great and fantastic and everything that The House Next Door wasn't. Also, I'm thirsty because I've been filming for over an hour. Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. Oh my goodness, fantastic. Why does that name sound familiar, Ryan? That's because Celeste Ng also wrote Little Fires Everywhere, which is super big on BookTube right now. It's like a show that everyone's watching. People are losing their nut over it. Everything I Never Told You was Celeste Ng's debut novel. And so essentially what the story is about is that this girl whose name I still can't remember. I feel so bad for not being able to remember every single character's name. But once again, this was several weeks ago, and like I said, 32 bucks. And so essentially she drowns, and they're trying to figure out if it was a suicide, if it was a homicide, if it was an accident, and no one really knows. And so I pick up this book thinking it's going to be a thriller, small town, missing girl, maybe it's going to be some Laura Palmer-esque bullshit, and I'm always down for some Laura Palmer-esque bullshit. What I got instead, and when I say this, this is not a complaint, is actually a very intense, very intimate family, domestic drama is the phrase. And it basically follows her family and the fallout of her death, but also the events leading up to her death, and really how the family dynamic plays out. So some really big themes of the story are the effects of sexism and racism in America, specifically xenophobia, since the family is Chinese American. And so the father is a first generational Chinese immigrant, and the wife is a just white American. So yeah, but essentially they're both dealing with their own kind of limitations due to the sexism and racism in society, and because of that, they definitely put a lot of pressure on their children, specifically the daughter. In fact, because of the parents kind of vicariously living through the daughter, they tend to neglect the other two children, and you also get their perspectives and how that neglect really affects them emotionally and psychologically. And so, I loved everything about this book. It was just so emotional, it was so impactful, and it's definitely a book that I want people to read if they're going to read books, because I think that books are good for fun, they're good for escapism, but there's also books out there that are very important to read because they give you a very great perspective to things that you wouldn't think about, that you wouldn't care to think about until you read it and you have a reality that you can face and sort of wrap your mind around, I guess. And that sounds like so patronizing, but it's like, I like this book because it was really able to just tell a story that I was able to just experience, that I was able to see for somebody else's eyes and understand a world that I would have never been able to connect to. And so I really, really liked the story because of that. And so, yeah, it was really great. I don't really have too much else to say about it. And a lot of these like big books that I'm talking about, I've already done weekly reading vlogs where I really get into the paint with it. So, yeah, you can check out some of my weekly reading vlogs. I will have a list of my bookish videos, like, along the at the end as well, so that you can just like find those and watch them. And yeah. So next up, I was like, I was kind of going for a reading slump after Everything I Never Told You, and so I just wanted to read something like, really short, really casual. And so I actually read just two really short queer books because it was like, Pride Month. So first up was All Creatures Great and Small by Casper Quill, and this is somewhere, like, it's kind of a short story. It's pretty short. It's like 38 pages. And oh my gosh, I give this 2 stars. It was not great. And why wasn't it great, Ryan? Well, first, let's discuss why this story was written. It was written in 2017 for an advent calendar called Stocking Stuffers, which was basically 30 days of doujinshi, like, boy love, so that, like, Midwestern moms could get it on by thinking about all these people begging. And so it was, like, really short, kind of trashy, like, romance. And hey, I like pulp, I like trash, I don't mind. But it's like, it wasn't meant to be like, high quality literature, The reason why I even picked it up was mostly just because of the cover, which, by the way, all of the books that were part of this 2017 Stocking Stuffers Advent Calendar share this cover. And I was actually a little disappointed because it felt a little bit clickbaity because, like, I saw the cover and I'm just like, okay, some interracial romance with, like, a Gil Elfgren style pinup like cover, and I'm just like, that's my shit. I love pinup. I see a book with pinup on it, I'm just like, it gotta be good because I love pinup. But unfortunately, since that is the cover of all 30 short stories in this collection, it did not feature Santa Claus stuffing somebody's stockings of a black man. I'm just like, really? And it pretty much, I'm trying to remember, I don't remember the names of any of the characters because honestly, it doesn't matter. It follows the story of some guy, he's gay, like, good to know. They tell you the first thing, it's just like, by the way, I'm a raging homosexual, and I'm just like, cool fam, thanks for the update. And pretty much, he's just like, he finds a cat beside the road, and he's like, that pussy. I'm gonna give that pussy the best Christmas ever. And through it, he basically seduces his landlord, who is pretty much just a preppy guy, and he speaks like, an 18th century literary character, and it's obnoxious. Like, he speaks overly formally and, like, poshly the whole time for no reason, and I'm just like, hey, posh people have a personality, and this is a terrible characterization. Well, folks, you've met lesbians who love their dogs, but are you ready for animal-hoarding gays? Because this is what that story is about. Also, while I'm at it, repeat after me. Toxic personality traits are not quirky. That was shit. But I am not a sassy... Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that story, so let's just... With that joke, so I'm getting... Like, I am not a sassy tweet, so I cannot do it well. But it's like, basically, this dude has some animal hoarding problem, and it's presented as some cute shit, and it is not some cute shit. You need to stop getting animals, fam. You live in a one-part apartment bedroom, and I am tired of this bullshit. And it was supposed to be cute. It wasn't cute. The romance was, honestly, insta-love. Like, it went from enemies to lovers to insta-love in 0.5 seconds. And I'm just like, wow, you put up a Christmas tree, you get that dick. That's how relationships work, apparently. And I'm just like, Casper Quill, what the fuck did I just read? Yeah, so I give it 2 stars. That's pretty trash. Another book I read was A Church for All by Gail E. Pittman and, I believe, illustrated by Laura Fournier. And it was essentially the story, and it's basically a picture book discussing the concepts of open and assuring churches, which are essentially churches that deal with, which are LGBT inclusive. So I wasn't familiar with this concept beforehand, but, I am happy to see it. Like I said before, I'm a religious person, and I'm an ally. Like, I stand for, like, all LGBTIA+, peeps. And so it's like, I like that, that it was really just a message of faith and spirituality that was all-inclusive, that was, like, love is love. And that was some good shit. It was wholesome. It was nice. I like that it was a children's book because you can have some pretty toxic religious children's literature out there. And I like that, there is a religious sect of, Christians that aren't super raging homophobes. So, yes. I gave that, I think, 4 or 5 stars. I don't remember off the top of my head, but you can go check my Goodreads if you really want to know. And I liked it. So this is kind of like where I get towards the end of my reading, and which is probably really good because my phone is dying. And so that is, let's see, Talking to Strangers, Malcolm Gladwell. I actually really liked it. I don't remember why I picked it up. I think it was just because it sounded interesting, and I had never read a Malcolm Gladwell book before. I had heard of him, Outliers was required reading in my high school. Not for me, but for other people, so my friends read it. And so I wanted to check him out. I actually really liked it. He had a very once again Aaron Mansky type discussion where you got into these historical anecdotes, and that tied into sort of what he wanted to talk about. And I'm not really sure how to describe it other than nonfiction, but he's basically talking about how he perceives strangers and some of the fallacies that we have as humans and how we perceive people. Like how one was transparency. Essentially, we assume that the way that people express emotions or the way that we think people should express emotions is honestly always accurate, which is completely untrue. People express emotions in a lot of different ways, and people hide and mask their emotions in a lot of ways. And so obviously, that is a fallacy that we have, and it deals with how we affect, act with strangers. That's why it's called Talking to Strangers, And so it brings up a lot of shit the Cuban Missile Crisis, the court case of Amanda Knox, a bunch of other things, and it gets into some really intense things like the issues of rape culture in America, and the Black Lives Matter movement. Actually, it discusses it in its later chapters. And I don't feel like Gladwell really paid off with the discussion as much as I wanted him to, but he did bring a lot of interesting context that I really liked learning about, and I really enjoyed reading because it gave me a interesting idea of it gave me some food for thought, and I enjoyed the book. So I don't remember what I rated on Goodreads, but I'll probably give it about 4 stars, just thinking back of it. It was a good book. Wasn't the most profound thing I ever read, but I liked it and I enjoyed it. So next up, I read my 3rd memoir, and that was Save Me the Plums by Ruth Reichl. Ruth Reichl was the editor-in-chief for Gourmet Magazine, which, if you don't know, was an American food magazine. Apparently, it's not a magazine anymore, and that makes me a sad boy. And so Save Me the Plums was basically Ruth Reichl's sort of experience as becoming the editor-in-chief, doing her editing job for so long, and eventually having to put her baby back into the the ground to sleep forever. Excuse me, I'm having the whisper. Hi, welcome to my quality channel. Anyway, and so I really enjoyed the way she wrote. She had a really great voice, and I can't really say much more about that. If you like memoirs, if you like reading about sort of magazines, I think it would definitely be the type of book for you, but I just really don't have too much to say about it right this second. I also did a reading vlog on this one, so if you want to hear some more thoughts about it, go check that out. And let's actually move on, because the last two books were really, really important. So around this time, I think it was around June 2nd that this happened. As you guys know, the death of George Floyd happened, and so it was very impactful on everything, because it should be. And there was a lot of reinsurgence with us thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement, with us really considering the impacts of racism and, I guess, the casualties of racism in America. And so at that point, I said to myself, I really need to do what I can to be an ally, and if one thing I can do is educate myself, that's what I should do. And so that's when I tried to read more Black voices at this moment. And so the last two books that I've read had to do with, my efforts to actually try that. So first up, I thought, first off, nonfiction, The Hate You Give, Angie Thomas. If you don't know, it is a young adult contemporary that deals with the Black Lives Matter movement and police brutality. And it is just really profound. I've given some bunch of words on it with my reading vlog where I discussed this, but I'm going to rehash it here just to let you guys know. Some things I really loved was just the perspective. Star was a fantastic character. Really, all the characters were so in-depth and so well written. And I really loved how it just gave perspective and a lot of sympathy towards the situations that, they dealt with. It dealt with a lot of issues of racism, like microaggressions, and I guess just media bias so well. And it also gave me a lot of food for thought about some things that I really don't always consider. Like, I guess, sympathy for, really the complexity of drug dealers. Because in the book, there is an issue of, one of the characters being a drug dealer, and they discuss sort of not only his feelings of it, because obviously drugs are horrible and drugs are bad, but they also discuss, sort of the social ills about that and really get into some of the issues of the story. And so there's a lot of just really complex characters in the book itself, and I think it's just a really important read for so many different reasons. And you really owe it to yourself, and you really owe it to a lot of people to really consume this book, to really try to understand what it's trying to say. And also just because it's a really well-written novel, regardless of, I guess, its social political commentary. And so you get that, really in-depth political commentary and social commentary, but you also just get a very well-written, just absolutely fantastic sort of coming-of-age... Yes, is it coming-of-age? Not really. It's a really fantastic, young adult novel. And I love the protagonist. I love the issues she was dealing with. Well, I didn't love the issues she was dealing with because she was dealing with, systematic racism. But I liked that, I liked the stuff that wasn't horrible and dark, she had a life outside of the events that happened to her, which is good because she's a human being. Well, she's a fictional character, but you know what I mean. And it was just such a well-written book. And I think you should really read it. I think it's important and relevant for, this time period, which it should always be relevant, but especially for everything that's happening, I think that you owe it to yourself and to others to read The Hate You Give. I think it was a really profound book. 5 stars. Next up was a fiction novel. See, there I go again. Fiction book. I could probably say Hi, welcome to me forgetting how to say words. Next up is a non-fiction book about race and anti-racism and all that. So You Want to Talk About Race by Ajima Odo. And I really enjoyed reading this book. I thought it was just fantastic. She really goes in deep on a lot of concepts that I guess just were not really well explained to me when I was, really, I guess, sort of developing my political stances and things. So she talks about intersectionality. She talks about the male minority myth. She talks about sort of microaggression. She talks about all of these different elements of just systematic racism and the issues that proceed. And I think that if you're looking for a really good primer on just anti-racism and systematic oppression in America and abroad, this is the type of book that you should be reading. This is a great book if you're trying to have anti-racist education, and I just absolutely loved reading this. It was so impactful. It was so well written. It really helped me deal with a lot of issues of my own white fragility and my privilege. And so I think that it's a book that really can help you sort of, I guess, dismantle your defenses and really listen to what people are trying to say. So, 5 stars. So, I'm going to take a break for a second, charge my phone, and then we can get into the books I didn't quite finish reading for, my wrap-up. Okay, guys, I had to take a break for a little bit, mostly because my phone was dying. But let's get into the 2 books that I did DNF this quarantine, and a few of my put-downs, which are basically books that I have just not finished. So first up is The Cabin 10 by Ruth Ware, which, if you don't remember, was the first book I actually read partially during my quarantine, and I just didn't care for it. I've already been over why. Mostly, it's just the pacing was slow, I wasn't understanding the characters, and I just wasn't enjoying it, so I put it down. The other one was The Music of What Happens by Bill Koenigsberg, which essentially just, there was a lot of bullshit about it. I went into it in my weekly reading vlog, why I didn't like it, why it pissed me off. It's just, I didn't like the main character, Simon. I thought he was just the most whiny baby ever. I didn't like his friends. I didn't like a lot of the things about it, and it just started irking me. It started pissing me off, and I put it down because I was so sick of it by that point. So I'm not giving them ratings just because I didn't finish the book. I don't think it's fair to them to give them ratings. But obviously, since I put them down because I didn't enjoy them, they're not great ratings in my opinion. Then I put down 4 books during the quarantine. These are pretty much books that I started, I couldn't finish, but I want to eventually. And I'm just going to read those off. Let's see, I have The Lilac Girls, who I forgot to write down the name of, but I'll put up here. Undercurrents by Nora Roberts, Imagine a Friend by Stephen Krabensky, and Me and White Supremacy by Layla F. Said. So, guys, this is pretty much all the books that I read during my quarantine. I am kind of exhausted from doing this video. I wasn't expecting it to be this long, but this is kind of my first wrap-up that I've ever done. Obviously, in the future, my wrap-up is going to be shorter. I'm going to get better at this, but this is just sort of like, my first kind of wrap-up video. So, hopefully you enjoyed it. Hopefully, I told you about some books that you thought were fun to read. And if you have any suggestions, any criticism of this video, or just suggestions on how to, I guess, make better wrap-up or booktube videos, please comment down below. This is something new that I'm doing on my channel, and I really would love all the help that you could give me. So, thank you guys for listening. Thank you for watching this video. I know it was super long. I haven't edited it yet, obviously, because, I'm filming right now, but oh my goodness, this is going to be such a long video when it comes out. It's going to be at least an hour, I know it, and thanks for watching it. You are the real VIP, Yeah, VIP. Anyway, guys, I'm going to head out. I'm a little bit tired. I kind of want to get all of these clothing, kind of drink something because my voice is a little sore because of all the talking I've been doing, and just, kind of relax because I've kind of been, working all day, and I'm kind of tired. So, thanks fam. Remember, wash your hands, tell your loved ones you love them, and do something every day that makes you a better person. And, be the person you want to be in the world, So, thanks guys. False Bulls Free, and I'm signing off.